All right, welcome everyone. This is our second work session of the day, this one dealing with residential parking and the recommendations of the working group and staff to the board. Just to clarify, and I'm going to bring Libby, why don't I do that first? We have one of our colleagues who is not able to join us at the table today, but she is remoting in. She'll be participating over the phone. So I, by law, have to read this. I have been notified by Libby Garvey that she's unable to attend today's meeting because of a temporary disability that prevents her physically attending the meeting, and that she would like to participate by phone from the southern part of Arlington. This is allowed by law, and the board's policy and arrangements have been made for her participation. I will ask the clerk to record Libby's notification in the minutes of today's meeting. Okay? And we'll get Libby on board. Hi, Libby, welcome. We are about to start the work session, so you are engaged. Much, Jay. Thanks. So today's work session is on the residential parking. Want to thank, before we get started, the staff for their work to date, and Susan Bell, I know, was a consultant to the process, and James Schroll chaired the working group. How many people that were on the working group are here with us today in the audience? Anybody?
None here, although one of the members did say that he would be arriving late.
Okay, so there may be a member showing up, but thanks to all those who put some time and energy into this. This is the next step along the way. I think it was several years ago where we tackled the issue of the parking ratios in commercial buildings, high-rise commercial buildings, and that took a while. And once again, as we tackled it with the residential high-rise buildings in the corridor, it's taking a while. And we hope to get through this with some questions, if we have them, for the staff, and then we'll talk about what the next steps are in the process. So I'm going to turn it over first to Mark to start us off.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have Stephen Krim is with us today. I think you've all met him. He's with our parking program, and he's going to deliver the slides. And then we have James and our esteemed colleague, former this is like old CPHD day here. So Susan Bell. So with that, I'm going to make sure that Stephen has the slide presentation up, and we'll be ready to go.
Okay.
Well, as that gets loaded up, thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. As we've discussed, we are here tonight to act or on a follow-up on a request from the board in December of 2013 to initiate a study akin to the one completed for commercial parking ratios, but for residential multifamily projects that are approved through the site plan process in the metro corridors. I want to also extend my thanks before we get going to James Schroll, the chair of our working group. The work that he and his 10 fellow working group members is greatly appreciated, and we certainly thank him for continuing to appear for meetings on this topic. And of course also to Susan Bell, who's been invaluable as a consultant on the project. What we want to show you tonight is a draft policy that staff have created based on a few inputs. And what we hope to do with you is achieve two goals in addition to simply answering any questions that you may have for staff. The first of those is to receive any guidance from you on what you would be interested in seeing changed from what we're presenting tonight, and then also to get an understanding of what you would like in terms of a time frame for bringing this proposal or a staff proposal to action by the advisory commissions and also yourselves as the board. Now, as a reminder, what we're going to be talking about here tonight is policy. This is not a change to the zoning ordinance. It is also a policy that, as I mentioned, applies only to certain zoning districts in the Roslyn, Ballston, Jefferson, Davis corridors. It would not apply to Lee Highway or Columbia Pike. And I think it's also important to realize that this is a process meant to create policy to standardize and clarify existing practice. As you know, the board has approved apartments and condos through the site plan process in the past that have fewer parking spaces than called for in the by right section of the zoning ordinance. And what we're trying to do is clarify and standardize the conditions under which those approvals are granted. And the board to this point, based on staff recommendation, have approved these looking at various aspects of existing broader county policy. So in our comprehensive plan and the sector plans that have been promulgated over the decades, you'll see a variety of calls for flexibility related to transit availability, other modes of transportation, calls for development to share parking, and to balance the needs for parking with other community goals. With this broader policy, combined with some scans of practices in other communities, and data collected about parking demand at multifamily buildings as well as vehicle ownership that we've seen recently in Arlington County, staff embarked on a process that began last September, and which included a multi-pronged approach to community participation. Central to that, of course, was the working group, which had members pulled from a variety of the board and manager advisory commissions, as well as NAOP, Civic Federation, and the Arlington Chamber of Commerce. In addition to that working group, we have made presentations to 4 of the advisory commissions. We have made 9 presentations to various community groups and held 2 open houses, as well as 2 focus groups. And then through an online survey that was available in April, we've received about 370 comments from individuals. Before I describe the specific elements of the staff recommendation, I want to mention some of the benefits that we see as potentially on offer from this policy if adopted. First of all, we believe that the policy that we're sharing with you tonight would support transit. And if you ask how does it do that, it's like, well, we believe that this policy would create the flexibility necessary to build more transit-oriented housing in the 2 metro corridors. Over the next few years to 2030, the housing stock in the 2 metro corridors is set to increase by 19%. And if we increase the flexibility for parking ratios, we can allow the development community to create housing that is geared towards households that are more dependent on transit, that use transit, and that own fewer vehicles. You see here a graph that demonstrates the difference in transit commute mode share based on vehicle ownership. And we think that, therefore, this policy is right in line with the continuing and growing commitment that Arlington County is making to transit through Metro and the ART system. We think that this policy also assists with the creation of affordable housing, which, as we know, the Affordable Housing Master Plan describes as vital to the social and economic sustainability of the community. And finally, of course, we believe that this recommendation will create predictability for all in the approval process, be that staff, developers, or the wider community. Now, for your reference, here is a map of the areas where this policy would be in effect, or where it would apply to site plan and certain use permit development in the metro corridors. Those are the zoning districts there depicted in the pink, Ms. Crystal there in the blue. You'll also see on this map that we have included the block faces nearby that have metered parking or residential permit parking restrictions. And then finally, distance bans from Metro, which I think are all good reference points, and I'll be happy to bring us back to this map for later questions. The core of this policy proposal is really on this slide, and there are 2 major parts. The part on the lower half shows a set of parking minimums, and these vary in 2 ways. One, the parking minimums increase as you get further away from a metro station entrance. So you'll see here that under this proposal, At the closest points to Metro, under 1/8 of a mile from a Metro station entrance, developments could be constructed with as few as 0.2 spaces of parking per unit, or 2 spaces for every 10 apartments, increasing to 0.6 over 3/4 of a mile from Metro, but still within the Metro corridor. The other component of the lower half of this slide is that the minimums would differ based on whether or not a unit was a committed affordable unit. So in other words, you'll see that for 60% of AMI targeted committed affordable units, a developer would only need to provide 70% of the number of parking spaces that they would be required to provide for each market rate unit. And then the requirement goes down as the affordability requirement goes up. So the hardest to build units, those targeted for people or households making 40% of area median income, would actually have no minimum requirement. Now, the other half of this slide is the part above, which is the introduction of an excess parking threshold, which is set here at 1.65. Now, what is an excess parking threshold? Well, what this means is that if a developer were choose to build more parking than 1.65 spaces per unit, then they would be required to pay a mitigation contribution of approximately $3,000 per year for 30 years, or place that parking in a tandem configuration or stacker configuration. Now, the reason for this in our policy is that the Master Transportation Plan guides us to ensure that excessive parking is not built. Researchers around the world and data in Arlington corroborate the finding that housing with more parking attracts households with more vehicles. Now, I want to go through a few slides that put this proposal, or these core elements of the proposal, in context. So first of all, this proposal would increase flexibility from the current by right zoning ordinance, which was last adjusted for this land use in the 1960s, and which you can see here in the 2 green bars. This policy is also more flexible than recent site plan approvals, which you see as ranges here depicted by the red bars, and which are broken out by distance to Metro. Then you also see that we've added in here the recently seen parking demand at market rate and mixed-use buildings in the Metro corridors. This is data taken from our studies of garages at site plan buildings. It's also based on data from the Commissioner of Revenue about vehicle registration. Now, one of the key points here is that this recommendation puts the minimums lower than recently seen demand, in at least up until about a half a mile away from Metro. And we've done that purposely in order to create a forward-looking policy proposal that allows for a future and a built environment and housing that is geared towards lower car ownership. And I think this is similar to the conversation that was had around the TDP at your work session a few weeks ago, where the point was brought up that we should be providing transit not necessarily just for present demand of transit, but for future demand of transit, or the future that we want to see. What we're trying to do here is to create a policy that allows for the building that we want to see moving into the future. Also here in the green bars, you'll see the ranges of parking demand seen at 100% committed affordable projects. And you'll see that in general, demand, or the ranges of demand, are lower than those for market rate buildings. And we believe then that this policy proposal would allow developers to better match demand at committed affordable buildings with the supply. In addition to those core elements of the proposal, we have included provisions where a developer would be able to substitute a few parking spaces for investments in bike parking over and above the minimum required in the current base site plan conditions, and also investment in car share. There are various exchanges possible based on the level of investment. The bike share investment would require the cost of the station as well as at least 6 years of operating expenses, while the car share investment would require a service guarantee. In other words, the building has to guarantee that a service will be there to provide the car share vehicle, not just the space, for at least 3 years. Now, everything I've shown you thus far has been exactly the same as what the working group submitted to the county manager back in March. This next item is actually something that the staff have added since that time. This is a dedicated visitor parking space requirement that would be in addition to what you've seen before. It would be set at 0.05 spaces per unit, and it could not be exchanged for bike share or car share or bike parking investment. And in addition to simply providing the spaces, the site plan, like all site plans, would have to submit a parking management plan to demonstrate how these spaces would be maintained open for visitor use. We've added this in part because of one of the frequent concerns heard when we shared this proposal with the community, or the working group's proposal with the community, was of course spillover parking, or the belief that if there is less parking at a building, then people will simply park their vehicles on the streets. One of the pieces of data, though, that we looked at was occupancy at metered spaces in the metro corridors. As you'll recall from the maps that we've shared, there is metered parking throughout these areas. And the interesting thing about the meter occupancy in the evenings is that it actually peaks at 7 p.m., not midnight or sometime in the middle of the night when you'd expect people who had come home to be leaving their vehicles. We believe then that the perceived and real shortage of parking in these areas is actually due to visitors either to residential buildings or to businesses nearby, which is why we're proposing a targeted increase for visitors from the working group proposal. Like the working group, we are also proposing language to encourage shared parking, which is encouraged in our broader policy documents in multiple places. But this would allow for both on-site shared parking between two uses that demand parking at different times of the day, say residential and office, and also off-site shared parking, where if there is excess parking in, say, an office building within 800 feet of the new residential building, the developer could fulfill some of their parking requirement at that building. A clarification that we've made since the working group completed its work is that, again, visitor parking could not be located off-site, nor could any of the handicap parking, which is probably not possible under the Americans with Disabilities Act anyway, but we want to be clear about that and the intent of this policy. Yes.
Please, what you said about the handicap?
Yes, so we are proposing that our policy would clearly state that the handicap parking spaces required would need to be located on-site, not in an off-site shared arrangement.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you, Steve.
Certainly. Finally, we are setting out a policy element that would provide clear guidance on when to let developers build less parking, simply because the size of the site or other site conditions make providing the otherwise required parking unfeasible. So after trying all of these other, or after looking at all of these other policy elements, if the developer is still facing some sort of physical constraint, then they would be able to request up to 10% of the remaining requirement to be taken off of their requirement due to a variety of sources, including or a variety of conditions, including underground immovable utilities, metro tunnels, or size and configuration, or a historic building that's intended to be preserved and reused as part of the project. Two final modifications that staff have made, or additions that staff have made. We are proposing that the minimum number of handicap spaces be set above that which would be required in the building code. I can get into a little bit more detail about that later, but one of the responses that we've made from speaking with the Disability Advisory Committee is to increase that minimum amount that must be provided as handicapped accessible. Finally, in response to concerns about slowing redevelopment of surface parking or somehow impacting other neighborhoods just outside of the metro corridors, we are including a provision where the off-site shared parking would only be allowed in other structured garages and only within the 2 metro corridors. You wouldn't be able to get your off-site shared parking somewhere a few blocks north of the metro planning areas. During briefings with you all, we did hear general support for a few of the provisions of the policies laid out here. And at your request, we did make another offer of presentations to civic associations. We made 3 of those presentations in the month of June. But of course, there are some questions that I think remain. And so in addition to simply answering any clarifying questions you might have now or anything else that you want to hear from us, we would like to start off conversation with these 2 questions. Particularly, we'd like your thoughts on flexibility around ratios for projects close to metro and flexibility based on the affordability restrictions of units. And with that, I look forward to talking.
All right, before we go to us, I'm going to ask James if you had anything you wanted to mention or frame at all as we begin a conversation with the board.
I think Stephen did a great job. I just want to thank Stephen and Susan for all their help. Also the other staff that are with us. We have other staff that have joined us, and I really appreciate their willingness to make themselves available. It wasn't just transportation staff. We have affordable housing staff that did some great research as well. So bang up job by staff, great support of the working group. And Susan, too, you were a great resource having led the commercial parking working group. You have a great perspective on both processes, and thank you so much for your help. Happy to answer any questions.
Okay, all right, well, I'm sure we'll have some for you. Well, since slide 20 tees up 2 particular questions, let's start with the first one. And the way I interpret this question is, do you support more flexibility for projects closer to metro? Is the question meant to, the flexibility is built into your recommendation, correct? So it really gets down to the flexibility. And if we're going to go back to the slide early on, where is that one? Slide 8. Okay, slide 8, which essentially on the bottom axis talks about 1/8 of a mile, 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, and then more than 3/4, where there is a sliding scale clearly based on proximity to metro. And so your first question is, does that make sense? Is that right? To have a sliding scale with metro at the fulcrum?
Correct.
Okay. Yes. Anybody else have a? Anybody have any questions about that one? And maybe we can talk a little bit about the detail of the flexibility and whether this makes sense.
I think the scheme as laid out is terrific. I think the questions that I have largely center around kind of the additional, I'm thinking of this, it almost is sort of akin to bonus density, right? Is the way we would talk about this at a planning level that can be earned. And so I think the only questions I have are just about some of those other criteria, the additional contributions to bike share or car sharing. I have some questions about the constrained property criteria and how that would interact with other kind of bonuses. But as laid out here, I think this is thoughtful, and the way it's presented is really helpful and reflects a great way of thinking about this, right? Proximity to transit has long guided our planning principles and ought to be reflected here as well.
So let's actually dig down into 1 or 2 of the things you then brought up related to this, because I'm not sensing that the issue of metro as a factor, or probably the issue of affordable housing as a factor, are the crux of the questions. It's about beyond that, how it's designed. So go ahead. And
I do have a couple questions on that score.
okay, well, let's go back to John then. Go ahead, John.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chairman. So certainly not an issue for me in terms of keying this off of affordability and distance. My question is really a little more detail oriented in that, you have this gradation, 40%, 50%, 60% of AMI, and I'm just wondering how data driven that was in terms of understanding at those levels what the car ownership data shows for folks in those economic strata.
So I think one slide that I have in an appendix here talks to a degree about the vehicle ownership patterns that we've seen in the county. So a variety of data sources all tell the same story, that vehicle ownership increases with income in the metro corridors and the county as a whole. I think some of the figures on the left are a little bit closer to your exact question. So 70% of the households that receive housing choice vouchers in Arlington do not own a vehicle. That's data from the Department of Human Services. Those are households that are generally below 40% of area median income. Those who are at approximately 60% of AMI, a third of those, or I'm sorry, 28% of those do not own a vehicle, and 37% of the households at 40% of AMI do not own a vehicle. Now, those figures are on the left are county-wide, so that's not within the corridors exactly. Some of the rationale behind then setting these different policy thresholds was based not only in lower demand for parking or vehicle ownership among lower income households, it's also based on the direction in the Master Transportation Plan and the Affordable Housing Master Plan to simply reduce the cost of producing affordable housing. And so knowing how much a parking space costs, we are also proposing a set of benchmarks or a set of thresholds that is not just about the fact that households with less income own fewer vehicles in general, but also that we are trying to make these units more affordable to produce. Housing staff was clear that basically anything we can do to get the production of 40% of AMI units is going to be helpful, and that we really need to allow down to zero to get more production of those units. And the 50% of AMI, it was set below the 60% in order to simply incentivize further the creation of those 50% targeted units.
Oh, okay, so go to the slide where you imposed an overlay on actual current demand. I think it's maybe the slide before. I'm sorry, go to the next slide.
Sure.
You're right, okay.
That's it, yeah.
So the up to 3/4 miles, it looks like it's, we're kind of in the zone, except that it doesn't drop down to zero for what would be the 40% of AMI, and then the green bar in the middle is a little higher. And I know that a lot of this is aspirational, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts as to how long you envision that it could take to get the parking demand down south, so to speak, more than it is now, in both scenarios, both for this slide and the other slide.
So, good question. What I would say is really key for looking at these green bars is that this is basically any 100% committed affordable project. And there are no committed affordable projects, nor does housing staff expect that there would be any all 40% of AMI projects. So these green bars that you see here are based on projects that have a mix of 60%, 50%, 40%. Okay. And any project, it's not that all units go to the least common denominator of zero. It's simply, okay, well, so tabulate your number of 50% units, tabulate your number of 40% units, tabulate your number of 60% units, and then your minimum is just multiplied by each of those. So I think that part of what you see here is the blending of different income groups within any particular project, which is what you would also see going forward.
Did you also do any, so you had the purple figures over on the left for 40% of AMI and 60%. Did you look at 80 and 100% as well, or no?
We did not.
Okay. All right, that's it for the moment.
Go back to that slide for a second, too. That my coffee is just not yet kicked in, so. Still. So, the number of households that own a vehicle in the Housing Choice Program is so incredibly different than lower income households overall, all within Arlington. That just seems striking. And whenever I see something so striking, I'm concerned.
Mr. Dorsey, could you repeat that question a little bit? I didn't hear it at the end.
So Ms. Garvey, we're looking at the slide, and as I'm
24.
understanding it, slide 24, thank you, Mr. Vizette, 70% of people who receive housing choice vouchers, formerly known as Section 8, don't own a vehicle, but 37% of low-income households, roughly, not an exact proxy, but roughly that demographic, don't own vehicles. So people who receive the vouchers, only 3 in 10 have a car, whereas for those households of that general income demographic overall, roughly 6 in 10 do.
So I don't have a good answer for you right now because those do come from 2 different data sets. So the lower one comes from that is actually from the Census Bureau, the numbers that you see there in the bottom, the 28% and the 37%. Okay. So I don't know how well the census picks up people who participate in the Housing Choice Voucher Program. But I can certainly follow up with DHS on the figure that they've reported to us. I can't really follow up too much with the Census Bureau in terms of asking them questions.
Stephen, that's fine, and just figuring out from DHS maybe what their methodology is for determining that would be useful. It's just a huge gap.
Well, also,
I understand what you're saying, and I appreciate that.
eligibility cutoff for participation in the housing choice voucher, do we know that offhand? Is it 40% AMI? It's not determined by AMI, it's.
No, it's not. It's totally
So,
different.
as we've talked about, right, there are folks who live in committed affordable units who do not participate in the housing choice voucher program. There are many people who participate in the housing choice voucher program and do live in committed affordable, but they're not interchangeable, right? And that could be.
They're not, but it's part of the same universe of people, so it's just.
It's a subset.
Yeah, but it's not necessarily the lowest income of the subset. So you could very well have people on housing choice vouchers who are at 40% of AMI. So it just, it's just,
It doesn't
anyway, I'd
make
love to
sense
learn
to
more.
you.
Yeah.
It's not intuitive to you. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Mr. Facette, if I could add on a little bit here.
Sure.
Yeah, on the bit about, the closer to Metro, the less parking you need, I totally get that. I think we're all fine with that. On the part, I'd like, which I think it sounds like staff is going to do, a little more research on our assumptions for the low-income folks, because what I've found, I think at least here on, on the Pike in some places, a lot of lower-income people, they're in service jobs, and they have to have cars to get to those service jobs. And I'm not convinced that it's always that low, and I worry about us going so low, possibly. I'm just a little nervous about that one. I guess I'd like to see a little more data and a little more convincing, and it may be that it depends on where people live, and it's different in the Ballston corridor than it is in along Columbia Pike. But as I say, there are a number of people that are in service jobs that they've got to be driving all the time. That's it.
Okay, Steve.
If I may, to Ms. Garvey's questions, yes, the issue that you raised is, of course, one that we have heard a lot, and I think James is shaking his head because it is something that he's heard with me at presentations a lot. Ms. Garvey, I do believe that part of it is, in fact, where people live, but also, of course, what we're talking about are general trends, and all of our data sources show the same general trends, but as they say, your mileage may vary, and each household, of course, may have very different job and lifestyle situations. Obviously, at the end of the day, we still believe that the affordable housing developer partners in this community are striving to create housing that is of benefit to the people that they are seeking to house. And so if they see a need for providing housing for people who do not work near Metro or have other life circumstances that require them cars. We generally trust and hope that they will be building for that, not just the minimum. But at the end of the day, if perhaps one unit or one project that doesn't have enough parking, that one project may not serve the needs of all low-income households, but we think that it is helpful to foster the production of any income-targeted housing in this community as it becomes less affordable.
Thank you, and I think it is important to look at the area around, because what we see happen sometimes, and I'm sure you've heard these stories too, is that there's nowhere for people to park, so they park on the street and they park in neighborhoods, which causes a lot of trouble at times.
Okay. John?
Yeah, so if we could go to slide 15, I'd like to get a little more understanding of how you calculated the visitor parking addition, which I applaud. I think it's sorely needed. And related to that, I'm wondering, you rattled off all the commissions and so forth and groups that you spoke with. Did you speak with our Economic Development Commission specifically?
Let me answer that second one first, because that's quicker. So Economic Development Commission elected to have an information item presented by one of the working group members back at its meeting in March. They asked us to make a presentation to Economic Development Commission when we were ready for action. So I have not made a presentation, nor has other staff made a presentation on this. However, we have spoken with AED, and there was, yes, one of the members on the working group was from Economic Development Commission.
Okay, one concern I have is, I mean, kind of a little bit supplementing Ms. Garvey's comment, but businesses big and small, and also ground floor retail. In other words, there's going to be visitors to these buildings, not just people who reside in these buildings who are going to be hopefully patronizing these businesses. And to the extent that street parking is obligated for other uses, whether it's, you know, bus parking or zip car, car to go, whatever, they're going to be looking for street parking or potentially parking in these buildings. So I'm just wondering how you're seeing our policy proposals tonight impacting ground floor retail and businesses in the corridor as well.
Well, I think that's a very important issue. I would start off by saying that the working group and staff both believe that the management of on-street space is best dealt with on-street policy, on-street management policy, be it meters, RPP, other time and manner restrictions. Obviously, this policy does not change anything about requirements for ground floor retail, so the same requirements and discounts remain. I am glad that you pointed out the way in which we hope that many of these building residents become patrons. I think some interesting reading I've done in the past few months is that as the retail sector has been so turned upside down, having more foot traffic around, having more people around is probably one of the best ways to support the viability of businesses at ground floor. And while there's always concern about business viability in this community, there's of course many reasons why businesses can survive or not survive. But I think that, again, our policy response is through our on-street policy, through meters and RPP in terms of controlling parking and making sure that there is enough turnover for business viability.
Mr. Leach?
I'm just going to supplement what Mr. Krim stated. Both the metro corridors, the RB corridor and the Crystal City, Pentagon City corridors are built. Sorry.
No, it's on. Just pull it closer.
Both of our metro corridors are built on a sea of commercial parking, much of which goes unused in the evenings and on weekends. And if you look at the County Park Arlington website, we'll see all of the commercial garages with occupancy that is in some cases very low. So in terms of augmenting the on-street supply, I would really look first to that commercial parking resource, because literally it is thousands and thousands of contiguous spaces in the case of Crystal City. In these residential buildings, you're talking about very small increments of parking that really are, in this case, intended to serve people going to that building, people visiting households in that building. So I would just say that in terms of addressing the business friendliness of our metro corridors, continuing to promote the availability of that publicly accessible commercial parking would be very important, along with managing the on-street spaces. And as Mr. Krim said, having more foot traffic in our metro corridors is actually very good for business.
How can we do a better job of that matchmaking, though, with the customer and the parking availability and shared parking?
I think there are a number of emerging parking apps that allow you to reserve parking in garages. And every time one enters the market in Arlington, we try to make that information available on our website.
I'll follow up. Thanks.
Katie?
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask some questions about the visitor parking as well, and a similar line of inquiry. So first, I'm really delighted to see the revised proposal for the 0.05 spaces per visitor. I think given this hypothesis, which seems relatively sound, that it's actually visitors, not residents, driving the parking, really appreciate the attempt to address what actually is causing the challenges, or at least intensive demand for the on-street parking spaces during certain hours. I just wanted to clarify, there are no current requirements for visitor parking in our 4.1 process, correct?
No, I mean, the parking, well, the amount of parking that is built is intended to serve all users to the building. However, it is left to building management as to how to divvy that up between visitors and residents.
And we could assume that perhaps a building manager might be interested in selling those spots to residents rather than making them available to visitors who don't pay.
I don't know.
Okay.
Garages are idiosyncratic. So that could be the case for some managers.
Okay. I just suggest that only because I think this is interesting, and that's actually possible that this policy, rather than exacerbating the demand for on-street parking, could actually start to reverse the trends or send them in opposite directions if, in fact, our hypothesis proves true, that what's spiking the demand is visitors, because there might be additional supply of visitor spaces relative to current, although I understand it's sort of hard to assess that. You'd have to do it garage by garage. And then I just wanted to ask, the information problem, that sort of undergirds, might have underutilized supply, and the reason it's not being distributed or matching demand is because of the information problem. So, Mr. Leach, you mentioned apps. I know, one of the other things that we've seen is, kind of physical cues or or signage or things that sort of direct people in real time. I do wonder, if this is our biggest challenge, this is evocative of conversations we've had recently in terms of, for example, the Wilson School site in Roslyn, folks who are interested in accessing supply that we believe is out there and people don't feel like they have ready access to. Can we get a little more aggressive than just making people aware of the latest and greatest apps? And has that been a subject of conversation, or would that need to be an explicit direction from the board to get a little more serious about trying to actively manage that information problem?
Can I just suggest, and I'm not going to opine, but as a topic to be thrown on the table at this point, there's also an economic issue, which is it typically costs more to park in a garage, and people prefer to pay at a meter where it's a lot cheaper, or find a free space. So I think that the economics of it are a big barrier to people seeking the very readily available parking in garages.
So it might be a rational economic actor problem as well as an information problem, is what you're saying.
Tossing that out as a possibility.
Okay, appreciate it.
I would say that it is a fairly labor-intensive effort to partner up with apps providers and the many commercial garage owners that may or may not want to cooperate. I think this could be a very useful role of our bids.
Okay.
Our three largest commercial office districts are Roslyn, Ballston, and Crystal City. And they're all about making those places easier to travel to and from. And so they could provide the forum for some more focused work in this area.
It's a helpful suggestion, thank you.
Can we go to slide, I want to walk through these slides. I guess you could start with the first 10, where you lay out these charts and you begin to layer on things. So I get the first one. So if you go to the second one, this is approved ratios for what? For residential buildings?
Correct, multifamily buildings through the site plan process.
Okay, so one of the challenges with the bars like this, or one of the things that might be helpful to refine a little into the future, is this suggests that up to a quarter mile, you had ranges from just under 0.6 up to 1.25. But it doesn't tell you like 90% were at 1.25 and 10% were at 0.6. Is that something that somehow could be reflected in the bar? Because the bar, I don't even know if there are buildings at each of those points along the way, or if this is just, there's an outlier.
Right, so to help with that, it doesn't directly make the slide that would be clear.
Slide in your hip pocket. Okay.
Always at the ready, trying to be. So anyway, these are the ratios at multifamily site plans as approved between 2010 and 2016. So you do see that there is some influence of outliers there. In 2014, We Work, We Live was approved. That was at 0.56. And then 2015, Ballston Common was approved at 0.7. For the most part, the other project, or I'm sorry, aside from those two, through 2016, all projects have been at 0.8 or above.
So what's a little or deceptive from this bar is if you just look at this bar on slide 11, a great portion of the bar is below 1. But in fact, if you go back to the one you had up there a moment ago, the majority are above 1. Okay, so there's got to be some way maybe of communicating that in the graph in the bar. I don't know if it's by shading of color, by putting in where the median is, or something like that, because...
Just keep the scatter plot.
Yeah, that's another, or just have it as a second slide. That's another way to do it. Okay, but at least I know what these are. Do you want to show us this? Do you have other scatter slides? Is that what they're called? Christian? Scatter plots. Okay. Show us the rest of them. What else you got over there? Come on.
Unfortunately, a lot of the other data that I have is in print, not on slides. So I could show it to you here physically now, but it will not be visible on the screen.
No, I think I got my point is, it's hard, there's a reaction to looking at these bars, and some of them, leave you with an impression. The only one, for example, on slide 12, where anything comes close to the excess threshold that you're creating is in the last bar. And we don't know if that's just one project and, everything else is lower, because everything else is below.
So to get perhaps a little more technical about this, so the bars represent all values except for like the mathematical outlier. So if you were to look at like a histogram, which is like a box and then some lines coming off of it to show the distribution, box and whisker plot, thank you, yes. This represents that full range, but it does not include outliers, which is just basically a function of how far away they are from the mean. So those very far, different projects are not in here, but the other range of projects from the 100th percentile all the way down to the 0 percentile are included.
Well,
and I'd be happy to share more detailed graphs.
Tell me what, in fact, that means ranges of recently seen parking demand at market rate / mix buildings.
Right. So,
Don't think I know what that means.
okay. So there are two data sources that feed into those bars. One is the results of our residential site plan performance monitoring studies, which are carried out on a periodic basis per site plan condition. As part of those studies, a team goes in and counts the number of cars in the garage, and then counts every car that comes in and out with some recalibration and rechecking in the middle of the night a few times.
The property owner does that.
We hire consultants that do that. The development pays for it, but it is then money paid to the county, and we manage that. The other source of data is Commissioner of Revenue vehicle registration data. Now, because registration does not equal vehicles present, for a variety of reasons, it could be visitors, it could be people trying to evade taxation, what have you, we adjusted those numbers upward because the Commissioner of Revenue data is always about 0.1 cars per apartment less than our site plan studies. So we took the Commissioner of Revenue data and adjusted all of those numbers up by 0.1.
This is the minimum. It's the minimum. What she's got is going to be the minimum, as you say, so you can adjust up a little bit.
Right. So what you see here is a mix of those two data sources, and again, I'd be happy to provide you with a more detailed breakout, but so that means that, say, at the 1/8 of a mile, we saw a building with as little as 0.7 cars parked per apartment, or 0.7 vehicles registered per apartment, with that margin added back on, up to as many as 1.1 cars parked per vehicle when we were monitoring the garages, or 1.1 of the adjusted registrations.
Oh, I see. So it's sort of a blended
On this chart, yes.
on this chart of both your counts and the commissioner's data.
Correct.
Plus 0.1.
Correct.
So what does it mean by market rate / mixed?
So in order to be able to show you this, we had to separate out the buildings in our data set that were 100% committed affordable. Now, mixed,
Mixed mean?
right. So a few projects that got committed affordable, or they included committed affordable units on site, those are in there. That's, I don't.
You mean mixed market rate and affordable?
Correct.
I thought commercial residential.
No.
Got it. So that helps clarify. Everything on here is residential.
Correct.
Okay, now that explains that.
But we haven't distinguished between condos and rental apartments, right? This is everything?
This is everything. This is everything regardless of the ownership structure.
Was there, well, let's just follow up on that one briefly. Is there a value in or a reason to distinguish the two
Between condo and apartment?
in terms of need or?
Right. So this was a topic of a lot of discussion. Yes, people in condos generally own more vehicles than those who live in rental apartments. There was a lot of discussion about whether or not to separate those out for the purpose of policy. However, of course, at the site plan approval process or site plan approval, we do not ask for a distinction between the two. So for that reason, because the policy direction early on in the working group process and the staff process as well, we're not going to create separate policy. We didn't continue to show them separated out, although I do believe that we're able to separate. I do believe somewhere I have a chart produced that shows the apartment and.
Applicant is coming in and they believe they're building a condo building. They will probably take that into account as well. So, okay, can we go to the next one then? Just as I work through these. And, obviously if you look at this, even with the imperfections of these bars, and what they mean. The only one that really easily hits the proposal or the future potential minimum is the affordable on the green, especially the green on the right? So that one gives you a great deal of comfort. The question, I guess, is, again, not knowing these scatter, the one thing, because some will look at this and say, okay, aspiration is one thing, but what I keep coming back to, though, is that what the blue bars represent is not our requirement, because almost every developer is going to come in and work with us to put in a parking requirement that's higher than that blue bar, at least for some good period of time, until the rest of those start coming down sufficiently to give people comfort that, in fact, they can market their building with less parking. So clarify for me or validate for me that for those people who are going to look at those blue bars and say, oh my God, how can you possibly build a building with 0.2 or 0.3 or 0.4? That isn't what this is doing, because a developer can come in and they're not going to propose to go to the minimum if they don't believe their building will work with less parking. The goal is sort of setting a long-term aspiration of what we'd like to reach, but without forcing anyone to start there.
Correct. I think yes. I mean, one of the difficulties in talking about parking minimums, and I think everybody on staff is also guilty of this sometimes, is that because that's the number that you see printed, it's really easy to anchor your thought process on that. So to look at it another way, maybe look at it as like, what we're talking about, free and clear is everything above these with no, payment required until you get up to this high bar. So think of it as like buildings likely coming in somewhere in here.
Right.
I'll add that there was an Economist magazine story a few months ago about off-street parking requirements, and they quoted a study that found that when the City of London eliminated all their parking minimums, new parking ratios didn't drop to 0, they dropped to 0.6.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now I'm sorry, but I have another.
They were being built at an average of 1.1.
Yeah, so cut in half almost. Let me ask one. I'm going to turn to my colleagues to see if you have follow-up questions, but I have one now for Susan Bell. Because you just mentioned something, you said this, no cost until you get to the dotted line, which is way too high. In my view, the dotted line is too high. But Susan was here when we went through the commercial parking ratio process. There was a lot of discussion about the value to the property owner, the developer, of reducing the number of spaces they needed to build. And at the same time, we have something to gain if, in fact, we accomplish our policy goals. But there was a different a contribution made and a system put in place for compensation or contribution to the TDM program and the other aspects of transportation management and choices that were seen to be important to bolster if, in fact, we were going to allow or encourage someone to reduce their costs by building fewer spaces. That the only benefit wasn't the environment, et cetera. So has that been discussed in this context? Is how do you place a dollar value on the savings and have some of that savings recouped to ensure or reinforce that the reduced parking will work?
I got that. There's a lot of questions in that question, but let me take it apart as best I can. I think when we were doing the commercial parking review, the feeling amongst the members of that working group was that we should be looking very closely at existing buildings and the variability in ratios that were being approved. And it's a very wide swing. It was everything from 1 per 580, which had been our standard for office buildings for a very long time, to 1 per 1,800 for the new buildings in Roslyn that would have managed garages. And the group felt that we needed to come up with ratios unique to those different geographies and the different underlying policies that supported those different kinds of ratios in actual approvals. And we did rely heavily on what had been approved, what had been built, and what was waiting to actually start construction. The developers on the group, as well as the citizen members, were interested in contributing to other sources of transportation through enhanced TDM or through dollar amounts. But they felt very strongly, the working group, I mean, that it was not appropriate to put a parking maximum on the overall policy. So when the ratios were established for each of the station areas, the notion was that it was better to put money in a fund to deal with the mitigation of impacts on transit, as opposed to some of the other options that this group has considered. We're several years out from the commercial parking study. I'm not sure that everybody would say that the approach that was taken with commercial parking has been a home run. Very few office buildings have been built, for one thing. Office demand remains low, generally in the region. Residential development has soared and continues to be a huge demand factor. And the nature of the trips that come out of a residential property are very different than those that come out of an office property. And the inventory of office parking spaces is very, very much understood to be wide open, given heavy federal use of transit even today. So I think some of the other elements that have been added to this proposal, everything from the exchange of parking spaces for bike share or for some other kind of bike spaces, additional car share spaces, those options were perceived as being better rather than coming up with a funding stream that is really not easily tied to the impacts of the reduced parking.
Okay, maybe I understand some of that, but for example, in this one where you have car share or bike parking, some of the docks, is that in lieu of, or is that in addition to the parking requirement? In other words, it doesn't replace it. Because in here, I thought it said that in lieu of 2 spaces, you'd have 10 bikes, or in lieu of 5 spaces, you'd have 1 car share.
So it's in lieu of, so in essence, you, off of the blue bars, you could take down a few spaces additionally through these mechanisms.
So it kind of contradicts, I think, what you just said, because it's, am I missing it? Because ultimately, the point is that if a person building a residential high-rise building gets to build less parking, those are really expensive spaces, right? And we're encouraging that. And we're saying if that is a $6 million savings in construction, we'd love for 2 million of that or 1.5 million of that or something. This is what I remember happening in the commercial side, to help bolster, not just to reduce the parking more, but to help bolster the TDM program to ensure that above and beyond, whether it's the residents having Metro passes for a little while longer, or how you in fact incentivize and bolster the TDM and other transportation choices. Do you see what I'm saying? It's the net here, the net is a savings to the developer, period, without some portion of it going back to help even reinforce and make sure that it works. Did you not even talk about that? Because it seems like a common, at least a discussion, especially since it was so fundamental to the commercial side of the.
Mr. Facette, I'm happy to kind of weigh in about what the working group discussed on this. As Mr. Krim noted, we did have a robust discussion on this matter. Where the working group got to, though, was kind of wanting to incentivize hitting these aspirational targets. We want projects to come that provide less parking. And so to do that, we want to penalize the overproduction of parking, not sort of penalize the underproduction. And so there was a robust discussion about, okay, well, how do you still provide the TDM measures you're talking about? And kind of where the working group got to was some of the ones you see on slide 14, which is additional bike parking.
Those are
And
good.
so
Those are good.
staff provided some good backgrounds on the difficulty in using some of the TDM that we currently have. And Mr. Krim can probably jump in here and talk about that. And also heard some from the development community that they don't necessarily feel, and this is anecdotal, but that people are avoiding trips because of the smart trip passes. And so, and Mr. Krim may want to take over here, but that's kind of what we discussed and kind of why we got to this point. And it is something that some other communities are doing, which is allowing people to go down kind of unpenalized to a point, and then penalizing kind of the overproduction of parking.
I guess I would add, and I love your comments on this too, is if the only penalty is for overproducing, I don't think this is going to do anything for overproducing, just because where that dotted line is so high, no one will be penalized. In other words, I mean, we haven't had anything, I think we heard in 10 years come in with a parking ratio above that dotted line. So there really is built into this, at least at the moment, no penalty.
Sure.
that I would see.
A comment on that, Mr. Facet, if I might, is the working group, some of these were kind of negotiations, as you would expect, and some folks that are on the table didn't want there to be any threshold set, and some felt that kind of following your point, a lower one should be set, and this was a compromise position to kind of get some consensus around the table. So
Let's go to Christian, if you want to weigh in. I mean, I'm not sure I've gotten my question fully answered, but others.
Yeah, I mean, I share some of those same concerns about value that we're creating, an opportunity, and what is sort of returned to the community writ large. But I'm not sure that I can articulate it any better than you just did, so it's not getting us where we need to go.
Can I try?
Sure, but then I also still have another question along those lines.
Sure, I wasn't trying to thwart your question. When Stephen, I think you were on 13 works as well as any of them, slide 13, and he was basically showing the band in which you could get proposals from developers. And so they could go as high as the 1.65, and they could go as low as the blue bar, depending on how far they were. So you'd get things in that range. And if in trying to capture, if you reduce below the zoning requirement, if you try to capture that value, here's why you should be removing barriers instead of trying to trying to capture that value, is because what Mr. Krim was describing in the beginning is that it's actually good for our investment in transit to attract, through having less parking available, to attract people who want to use transit. They'll have fewer cars. And we want those people. We're not indifferent to those people. Those are the people that we want.
That's the community benefit.
Yes. And so that's I think, I can't speak for the conversation that the working group had, but in the conversations that I've had with staff, that's why it's good, and that's why we should be removing barriers to lowering the amount of parking, because we want people who don't have cars who are more likely then to use public transportation and these alternative forms.
No, I think I get that. I think part of what we're all wrestling with, the wonky side, it's to what extent is this a latent demand versus reduced demand issue, and to what extent does this create spillover and consequences in other areas that we're not really measuring well or we don't fully have a handle on. And I think that's really kind of part of it. But if I could get to the next question before we kind of leave this whole value conversation, the three examples of what would further allow a reduction in parking, this slide. I think part of what I'm wrestling with here is, from a business standpoint, this is starting to get into the realm of a good business practice for any new multifamily development of any kind. You're going to probably want, as an amenity, to put a capital bike share there. You're going to want to have car sharing access. You're going to want to have, electric charging locations. To what extent are we providing further abilities to reduce, create value that you're not sharing for things that are really part of what a proper business plan ought to be. I mean, this is not scaled to be like LEED and bonus density, for example, that is constantly evolved and updated to new norms. This is kind of a static point in time that I think over time will become very normal for anybody who wants to build anything. And, you know, we're not getting any benefit from that.
Well, first to that, I would argue that any private support of networks that we want to see, I mean, because, you know, bike share and car share are networks, whether or not there's a private individual using them, obviously, the more people who have participating, the better cost recovery you have, especially on the bike share side. So there is a benefit to the community, though indirect, simply encouraging the developers to provide these benefits. I think also, though, a major point as to why we chose these is because these are the kinds of amenities that actually have some sort of tie or that would indicate that a developer is in fact intending to create a building that is for the kind of car light or car-free household that would need to live in a lower parked building without creating the kind of spillover that is of concern to so many different people. The only other thing I'll say is that, you know, as somewhat alluded to by Mrs. Bell and Mr. Leach, TDM in residential contexts is different from TDM in office contexts. And really, at the end of the day, the most effective form of TDM in a residential context is having tenants or owners or community members who simply own fewer vehicles, because once the vehicle is already there, it's already more likely to be used. At the commercial end, there's a lot that can be done by employers through transit benefits or buildings through other incentives like that. But at the end of the day with residential, it's about attracting that kind of household with that kind of lifestyle in the first place. And these are the kinds of amenities that also attract those households to a given project.
But specifically addressing your point, we do not see this as a common practice in our site plans today. We have a few, but it is in no way standard. Well, I'm saying where developers voluntarily provide a bike share station or voluntarily support car sharing or voluntarily go beyond our minimums for bike parking. These currently are not standard practices.
But you don't expect that they will be?
I think it's something that we would monitor closely over time.
All right. And then the next question concerns, so I would expect that the bike spaces, those would be captured for the life of the site plan. Yet for the other two, there are limited terms there. And can you just give us a sense of how you arrived at those being appropriate terms to be put on the table?
The part of the challenge with setting any of these time horizons is setting them such that they're not too long, such that nobody would ever take advantage of them. Because if some of these timeframes are decades long, then we could have it in policy, but nobody would ever actually make these kinds of investments. So what we're trying to do is get something that is at least some minimal amount, but isn't so onerous that the cost-benefit analysis doesn't work out. Specifically, the 6-year term was chosen for capital bike share because that is the time frame on which the bike share system is planned for capital investment. So the 6 years of operating investment is at least a window that says, okay, the developers come in, they say they're going to support it. It could be 10 years, it could be 20 years, depending on what they choose to propose, but at no less than 6, because you have an entire investment horizon with which to work in. There's going to be this station that the county either would have to support in an operating after the term ends, or which the county would just decide to remove if it decided it wasn't in the best interest of the system to keep in. So that's where the 6 comes from. The 3 years for the car share is actually simply something picked from another municipality that has a similar program, the city of Vancouver. There are not a lot of communities that do this, but that is a community that has multiple years of experience with this. And so we chose to basically look at what they were doing.
And final question on this one, can you just give me a ballpark of what the various expenses would be for both cabbie and for the car sharing? So aside from the dock and the station, what are the other costs associated with cabbie for 6 years, and what's a service agreement cost someone for a car share?
We were not able to come up with the cost of a service agreement. That's not something that's like publicly reported.
Just provide them a space.
No, well, so the additional element here beyond the space is that there has to be the guarantee that there will be Enterprise or Zipcar actually keeping a car there. Sometimes what has happened in the past is that a car share space will be provided, but the operator does not want to continue servicing that location because they aren't getting enough users. This is basically a revenue guarantee from the building to the car share operator that says, you will continue to serve my building and we'll agree that you will get a minimum of X amount of dollars every year in order for you to stay here and serve my residents. If the number of residents using it meets your revenue expectation, great, we pay you nothing extra. If it doesn't, we make up that difference. Now, in terms of the bike share expenses, unfortunately, I don't have that right with me. Yeah, I believe the number of the operating expenses does vary by the size of the station.
So just sit right up here. Come on.
Hello, Melissa McMahon. I want to say that the installation plus operating for first year was in the realm of $25,000. And then for subsequent years where you're not reinstalling the equipment, somewhere between $4,000 and $7,000 per year to operate. Yep.
Thank you. So that would be the annual payment, and there is a built-in maximum for our existing capital bike share sponsorship agreements. We have a cap of 5% escalation a year. So there would be, no more than increasing 5% each year for the operating agreement that the developer would propose.
So if we'll assume that these are equivalents, just say roughly, generously, say a couple $100,000 all in terms of what someone would pay for both of these, yet in as few as 6 or as few as 3 and as many as 6 years, they could then devote those spaces to revenue generating spaces within the building.
It's not a space. It's actually the equivalent of
But it will be taking up space.
outside, right? Is it indoors?
Well, the car share would likely be it could be in their garage, it could be on property, but accessible. It's not a guarantee that, we wouldn't set out where the car share space would need to be. But you are correct that for capital bike share, it's not like there's space in the garage that suddenly becomes free.
Yeah, they're not going to build the spaces. It's the equivalent of not building 2 that allows them to put the bike share outside. Right?
So, but it's going to have to be on their property.
On their property, or it could be on the right-of-way outside.
Well,
but they
actually-
can it and buy it.
Actually, no, we were anticipating that for the bike share, it would have to be, so that they're not somehow interfering with whatever plan is there for the public right-of-way. It has to be, accessible to the public, but not in the public right-of-way.
Whether it's parking spaces or a space for whatever purpose, it's going to be space that's going to become available to be repurposed in some other way. It may not necessarily be for density, but it could be for who knows what.
Bench.
A bench, outdoor patio space. I don't know. We can just be creative. But at some point, they're going to get dominion over either space in a garage or somewhere else on their property for a couple $100,000. And then you've got, at the same time, for the bike scenario, they lose space in a garage that could be purposed for something else for the life of the site plan. It just doesn't seem like those are equivalent. overall. Like, it seems like the bike piece is essentially permanent while the others are temporary.
Could I ask a question about car sharing?
Actually, just 1 second, Libby. Steve is just going to answer Christian.
Thank you, I just can't see. Yep.
Mr. Dorsey, you are correct. I mean, the bike share element of this part of our policy proposal is more permanent than for the car share or the bike share.
The what is more permanent?
The bike parking.
The bike parking, yeah, in the middle. Right. Okay. Okay, let's, Libby, I want to go to Libby and then Katie and then John. Is this on the same topic?
A quick question on the car sharing.
Yep.
Are you assuming, and I just may have missed this, you're assuming that they're going to be using one of the current car sharing companies? Or are you assuming that they themselves will have a car there that they're going to like take care of and provide for sharing in their building and they would manage it? I'm assuming you're planning on one of the companies doing it?
We would assume one of the companies would be doing it, yes. We actually I had not personally thought of the idea of a building being responsible for its own vehicle.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine it could happen, and the car sharing companies are pretty well established, but if,
Liability.
yeah, so that if the car sharing company, something happened there, we would expect them to find a way to provide it, even if it wasn't working out well with the car sharing company.
Okay. I'm going to go to Katie.
I think that the question about the creation of value and how much of it goes back to our multimodal network or other community goals feels unresolved to me, and I know we're all struggling to articulate it. But I think part of what I'm having a hard time with, and I'm hoping we can explore this a little bit at least before we leave it, is, I think I had been looking at this as sort of, we are all seeking to hasten a future that we are interested in, right? Which is a more multimodal corridor especially, right? With fewer cars and more people taking alternatives to the extent that it suits them and choices that allow them to do so. Heretofore, the ways we have done that, right, are the exchange of bonus density for contributions to our multimodal network. And I think maybe the disconnect I had coming in, and I'm now starting to see this, I think maybe through more of staff's and the working group's point of view, is that it's actually, this is not about the exchange of something on the part of the developer for contributions to the multimodal network, which is what we've done historically with density on site plans, but more about an assumption, and I want to test this with you all, that and I think this is what Ms. Minton was getting at, fewer parking spaces in the corridor is a community benefit, irrespective of any additional contributions to the multimodal network. Is that the assumption here?
I mean, it certainly is one of them. And our working group set out principles, and kind of one of them was getting to that point that, the less supply of vehicles, there's fewer burdens on our road network, more multimodal. And so there's certainly an assumption there that, to your point, Ms. Crystal, that absent any kind of financial benefit that you see in the policy that Mr. Grimm's walking through, there's something that's hard to capture, sort of an externality that it's a positive externality, that we're not going to have to pay as much for road maintenance. We maintain most of our own roads here, among other things, if there are fewer cars on the road.
Okay.
It's also a more inviting place to walk and bike. I mean, there's other benefits that are sort of hard to capture, and I think the working group took that into account to some extent.
Okay.
Does anyone else want to try to answer that? I mean, that was as good as we've
I'm
heard.
going to also make another shot at it.
Yeah.
And I would preface this by approximately 81% of all the housing in our metro corridors is already built with higher parking ratios. So we're actually talking about an increment. And sort of what is the policy direction? We don't operate in a vacuum in this region. The district already has far lower parking requirements, and as a result has far more carless households that are using transit and walking for most of their trips. To what extent do we want to provide more of a market for those households that are self-selecting. So we're in a region of 6 million people. People have choices of where they can rent or buy housing. Do we, as a community, want more transit-centric housing with less parking provided? Our metro corridors are more like the downtown core than they are suburban Virginia. And so we're at a crossover zone, and this policy is intended to be forward-looking, not kind of reflecting where we've been. So I think that is a fundamental question for this board.
That is really interesting, actually. I wonder if maybe a way to articulate that is, we never think of this. We think all the time about competing with the district for commercial or for business or office tenants. What you're saying is that we want to be competitive with the district for a certain type of resident.
Correct.
Okay. So the only other thing I wanted to test here as I wrap my head around this new understanding is there is a little bit of an assumption here, I think, based on what Ms. Minton was saying about when people maybe move into a building with fewer parking spaces, they are more likely to use transit. But I want to just test a little bit because I think what we've seen in Crystal City and Pentagon City, and I know we've talked about this in other contexts, particularly in the WMATA funding issue, is that actually there has been a drop-off in single occupancy commutes to work. At the same time, there's also been a drop-off in metro ridership in 22202. Isn't that correct?
That is correct. This is in our 22202 study, we saw a cresting of drive alone that crested much earlier. We saw a cresting of our metro ridership in 2010 and 2011, and that has been in decline. I think that telework is part of that. People using it for people because of reliability issues, making different decisions about whether to travel. And I think our office vacancy rate in the Pentagon City, Crystal City areas in particular have really hurt our transit share.
I mean, I guess I think the thing that I worry a little bit about making that assumption that there, as Mr. Dorsey's put it, there is a creation of value when fewer parking spaces are built. And if our assumption is we will capture the community's share of that value through increased ridership on transit, which then helps us, and not have to make up gaps for WMATA. If those things aren't actually substitute goods, right, and there are plenty of people who may come with fewer vehicles, but not actually then become riders of our transit networks, that assumption might be a little bit broken. So I think that's just something for us to continue to grapple with, but I do appreciate your help in allowing me to understand some of the underlying thinking about, again, kind of competing for a certain type of resident.
Can I continue with a question along that exact line? Because that was all very interesting. Thank you, Katie, for unearthing it, and Dennis for that framing. So do we have data that we look at to see whether or not our metro corridors do resemble what we see in some of the districts, more highly walkable corridors in terms of vehicles that people own and vehicle usage in terms of miles traveled, anything that we could sort of piece together? Because I do think, and again, anecdote is not analysis, but I'm certainly aware of a nice, decent person who lives in the metro corridor who has found someone with who never uses their flexible residential permit, and they've got a nice side deal where instead of paying for the parking in his building, he uses it to park on the street. And it's one example, but I am sure he's not the only one who's doing this in Arlington. So I just really would love to figure out to what extent we really know that this is a matter of parking minimums reducing demand versus our being a place unlike the district where people have other options and they're using them. And I don't know what is true. I just want to know if we can figure out to what extent it is true.
So one piece of evidence I do have on me tonight is this slide that comes from are the same data set that I showed you earlier with the number of vehicles parked observed in buildings. The second half of those studies that we do at Site Plan Buildings is a survey of the occupants. So what you see on the y-axis here is the number of off-street spaces per unit in all of the residential buildings that we've surveyed. And then on the y-axis, what you see is the number of vehicles per unit that the residents report they have. So regardless of where they park it or anything else, that's like the number that they say they own. So you do see a relationship between the number of spaces per unit provided and the number of cars per household as reported by the residents.
Y-axis?
The y-axis is the number of vehicles that the residents say they own. Oh, I'm sorry, maybe I misspoke. The x-axis is the number of spaces provided per unit, like in a garage or lot.
The number of spaces provided at that residential building.
Right, the amount of parking, the amount of off-street parking.
Okay, off-street. Okay, got it. I'm thinking on-street. Okay, got it.
So I think that is one piece of evidence about the relationship between vehicle ownership the self-selection that happens in buildings. In terms of travel patterns, I mean, I think again, some of the study that was done and compiled by ACCS on through the residential parking studies is helpful in looking at mode split, especially for commute behavior. Looking at the non-commute trip is a little more difficult. But yes, the metro corridors are certainly much more like the district in terms of their travel behavior than the rest of Arlington County is similar to the district. Vehicle ownership in Arlington is higher than it is in the district by far.
And we're making the link that that's because we have a greater availability of parking.
It is, yes. It is one factor.
I mean, it's the ultimate correlation causation problem, right? Where we just don't know where the direction of causality runs.
I would say that this is one image, right? This is one data set. However, it is consistent with studies that have been repeated in the district within the past few years that the District Department of Transportation underwrote. Studies have been completed in other parts of North America and Europe around the relationship between the provision and price of parking and the extent to which it's used. Now, just as a quick side note about your otherwise upstanding individual, hypothetical, or real.
Hypothetical, but nameless, anonymous.
Fine. We'll call him something. I don't know. Anyway, we strongly believe in our off-street, I'm doing the same thing you did, our on-street parking policy and the need to make sure that that is effective in managing on-street demand. So to the extent that there is fraud or abuse going on, we want to make sure that that's taken care of.
Not sure that that's actually fraud. It's possible, right?
Well, you're not supposed to transfer them in that case, but
the Flex Pass, he's not transferring he doesn't have a sticker from a residential household, which I think would be illegal. What he does is he uses a Flex Pass all the time.
if he is not, this is difficult to determine, but if you are not in fact visiting that household, you are not supposed to have that Flex Pass.
Just call the hotline, Christian.
I'm not going to out him.
Give you the non-emergency number and
John.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So Ms. Crystal and Mr. Leach alluded to this just a few minutes ago, and one of the things that's casting a pall over this discussion, I think, which we haven't talked about a whole lot, and that is Metro ridership and the challenge that Metro has. Ridership has been dropping since 2010. It's been dropping in Arlington, especially along the blue and yellow lines, but also along the orange line. So I guess my question is, how, given the fact that that's the case, are our goals and aspirations here, even more fantastical than some would like to think? Because we've got and granted, some of the decline in ridership is because of telecommuting and co-working and certain other kind of changing lifestyle factors, but a lot of it is because people have lost confidence in Metro, and they're unfortunately, and I'm a daily Metro user, but they're getting to work in other fashions, including cars and carpooling. So where is that in the quotient here, or in the equation? And then I want to go to slide 17 after this.
I would say that this is a policy that is oriented towards the metro corridors. The metro corridors are built on rail. We pay for it. It is really in this community's best interest to have full utilization of that rail system. And it's one of the reasons that we were the first to partner with Metro to do customer analysis to figure out how to actually get customers back on the system. We've got a number of things that have worked against us in terms of ridership. I think the reliability issues and then the impact of SafeTrack has been a big part of the story. A tremendous loss of federal jobs and federal contractor jobs in our metro corridors is another piece of that story. And it's going to be really tough to get those workers back. We can fill seats and we can have standing room with residents. Much of the Crystal City loss is loss of people that are no longer working there. And we have some of that same thing playing out in places like Ballston and Roslyn as well. But so getting actually transit-oriented households into this community that build a lifestyle, that make a choice, build a lifestyle around our rail and bus system, I think is really important for us.
Mr. Leach, do we have any data to show whether or not we're doing a better job, and I would assume we are and hope we are, of retaining Metro riders the closer they are to living near a Metro station? Can we measure that at all?
Absolutely. Our rail ridership for people that live, for example, a quarter of a mile from the Pentagon City Metro station is among the highest in the region. I think we have an excess of a 56% transit mode share for commute, which is outstanding.
No, right. I'm sure that what I'm saying is the relative loss. In other words, since 2010, with our ridership down, are we able to say that folks within a certain radius of the Metro station have done a better job of retaining their loyalty to Metro versus dissipating to other transit modes?
But Mr. Leach, but while you're formulating that, I just want to bring a little context on this because we're kind of talking about a bunch of different things, and actually the story with Metro is a little more nuanced. It's down, it's peak hour travel, so those commuters that we talk about, it's down about 5% system overall. It's a little larger in Arlington, but that 5% overall among peak hour commuters is pretty consistent with the decline in transit ridership nationally that we're seeing on heavy rail systems, which seems to indicate to me it's less about Metro's reliability issues, it's more about larger changes in how people move around. Where Metro is getting hammered is in the off-peak and on the weekends. A lot of that weekend work is due to planned track work where people just say, not even thinking about it, and during the off-peak where, walking, horse and buggy, and sometimes, other modes are quicker and more convenient than using Metro. So I think this is not to say that we're not concerned about ridership, but it's often been conflated that Metro's overall ridership numbers are a result of people fleeing Metro who would otherwise be the ones that we're designing this transit network for. And that's not really the case. I mean, in the peak hour, people still use it because for most people, it's the best option. It's much better than driving, and they're certainly not going to Uber, Lyft, or Sprint to work. So anyway, now you've got the time to formulate your wonderful answer.
It is actually the resident population that fills up those trains in the off-peak and the weekends if the service is there to support them. And as Stephen showed you in this slide, a carless household is likely a transit household, or even a household that has only one car is much more likely to be a regular transit user.
Okay, if you do have any more data on the geography of attrition, I'd appreciate it. Could we go to slide 16 for a second? I'm sorry, 17? Okay, So can we just talk a little bit about that? What I'm curious about is who is going to be making the judgment call as to whether a particular property has these physical constraints, and are you planning on doing some sort of, adding color to this or commentary that would give folks additional guidance as to when something might fall in those various categories? And then finally, can you think by example of any buildings, if this policy were in effect today, would fit within this box?
In terms of the level of detail, the context for this is that we came to the conclusion when trying to come up with data for the working group that it's very difficult to put some sort of numerical value on what is essentially supposed to be the wild card situation, but where we're bounding the wild cards a little bit. So the idea here is that these would be findings recommended by staff for the board regarding site conditions. Part of how we're trying to make this more predictable, though, is by, again, saying that this is supposed to be the last thing you go to. Now, in terms of further guidance, I think the guiding document that we will produce for staff will have more information about how we define these things. So, for example, I've spoken with the historic preservation team here. They did give me some resources of like lists you would perhaps consult for whether or not something qualifies as historic. And then they also said, you know what, at the end of the day, you can call us and we can give the opinion that this should qualify as a historic building. So yes, there is some additional detail that we can add, but it is not as quantitative or cut and dry as the other parts of the policy proposal.
What did you mean when you said that this was like a last resort or the last option? So a developer couldn't just go to this without doing anything else, or they could?
They couldn't. I mean, well,
could not?
Yes, you should be demonstrating that, like, even after these new minimums have already been taken into account, you've already searched for an off-site shared parking arrangement and that didn't work out. We can then talk about this remaining reduction.
Everything on this screen is about 10% below the parking minimums that you're proposing.
Correct.
I see. Okay, that's a helpful clarification.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
It's going to be a long time before this comes into play.
Yes. So,
If ever, yeah.
Mr. Chair, this is what I wanted to ask, though, because this is the slide that just when I think I grasped the framework, this slide is what pulls the rug out from under me, because if the idea is that it's a benefit to this community to have fewer parking spaces built, why not just allow 10% below our parking minimums? And if developers aren't going to get to the parking minimums, at least not anytime in the near future, because it's in their interest to build parking, why would they, their approach to the discovery of an immovable utility be to seek fewer parking spaces when that undermines the competitiveness of their building?
I'm sorry, I heard somebody pursing their lips like they wanted to contribute, and I don't want to foreclose that. I think that you raised some good questions, and this is why it's a difficult topic to deal with. It is an uncertainty situation, but we wanted to at least put out more guidance than is currently there about when to say, okay, because something about the site, you can have this reduction.
Okay.
I guess I'm not.
I don't know that there's a better answer to the question, honestly, but that's it's a fair response.
I mean, I'm not. I guess I'm just saying I don't understand how this really is a piece of the puzzle that we've been trying to move around tonight.
One of us brought it up in our briefings, and they've responded. That's what I'm gathering. And
What, the constraints?
this is a new slide, right? This is a new.
No.
Oh, I
No, it
thought
is
you
not.
said this was one of the new slides that was not in briefings 2 months ago.
That was, well, some of the elements, this part was new.
But going back to slide 17, am I putting you on the spot too much to speculate about a building that might fit within these metrics now? That if it were coming before us today, we'd say, you know what, we're going to give them that 10%.
A great example of a site that would meet this is the Wendy's site that was across from here. It was an odd shape. It was a triangle. It's an inefficient layout for a garage. I think my recollection is they did something kind of wonky to make the parking spaces fit, but when you do that, it's really expensive. And so if we're trying to as Stephen noted, didn't want to kind of set size parameters because it's kind of like a lot of things. You know it when you see it, but there's other ways to have an inefficient garage, and that was only one of the characteristics we wanted to talk about. The working group started with that conversation, but recognized because this is Metro Corridor, a lot of what you're looking at is immovable objects. You're looking at metro tunnels. You're looking at other elements underground that cannot be moved that are making a garage a different shape than would be ideal. And so, and yes, this is kind of the last thing you get to in a kind of a workflow, wanting there to be some community benefit, wanting there to be the bike spaces, wanting to be the other things to offset the parking first. Can you get down to a floor plan for your parking with adding those first to reduce the parking that you need to produce,
So
and
this
then
is only
come to this to
permitted-
offset the rest of it to try to get down to it efficiently.
Permitted after you've dealt with the car share parking spaces, bike parking, and bike share.
Correct.
So we'll hope the Wendy's site owner's not listening, but what you're saying is that just the challenge of the triangular space alone, a sources of constraint, why is there a bullet there?
That's a typo.
Huh?
That's a mistake.
Caption, right?
Correct.
Okay, so where is odd geometrics
So I
on
think that
here?
falls under site size. Stephen can kind of weigh in here.
size? Okay.
Site size here, because there's an ideal kind of shape and ratio for that. And if you don't have that, and if you have a triangular shaped lot, as the one across the street is, then you're not going to get that.
But I think what Katie articulated well, and this is where we have sort of undermined the whole argument before, the whole rationale for this is that we can come to a minimum where it's kind of like if you were charting this, you'd have the perfect nexus between reducing demand and latent demand. You'd be fine, and you wouldn't have any negative externalities in terms of spillover and other consequences. And then we're saying, on top of that, if you go even you can go even lower. On the first hand, if you provide TDM, so actual reduction strategies to accompany a reduction. But here, this is all relief for someone. And we're not capturing that relief at all, and we're dealing with all of the consequences because we're below that point at which we've dealt with the externalities, but we're providing relief on top of that and getting nothing for it. The points that you raised are all great. Yeah, these things happen. But the beneficiary of relief from the minimums are going to accrue to
The developer.
people, not the community. And how do we deal with that?
Can I interject something on that? I think the difference is having an underutilized site and having a site that redevelops and contributes a great deal more to the tax base, to the walkability of the community, to the built environment. So you can have a Wendy's there forever, or you could have the Pizza Hut that used to be on Wilson Boulevard that's now assisted living. You could have had the parking lot where the Strayer building is today. There's a variety of reasons why this was felt by the working group and by the staff that supported it to be something that needed to be addressed more specifically as opposed to dealt with in the moment of a specific project that had a constraint of the immovable utility or the metro tunnel. Virtually every project that runs up and down this section of Wilson Boulevard had to do seismic monitoring because of the proximity to the tunnel, and it forced their garages to be designed and constructed in a way that no one would consider efficient. And this one is by no means the worst of them. So I think, to the original point of your question, I think we felt that that site that remains, it's sort of the bad tooth where the infrastructure at the street hasn't been done, where there's the use that nobody really patronizes anymore is not a benefit to the community. But facilitating through this last little bit, getting a property redeveloped consistent with our plans was a better idea.
But we're still going to socialize the mitigants that are required to deal with the fact that we haven't dealt with the impact of reduced parking.
Well, you have all those other elements that you're using to deal with that. The other elements in the proposal as well as just general county policy for managing on-street and so forth.
But we're talking about 10% on top of that.
Equilibrium.
Right. I mean, if we accept where we were before, like we're going to arrive at a point where we're going to do actual parking levels based on where we think that sweet spot is, and then these are reductions above and beyond that, and then we get past all of the TDM strategies, and then we get into a 10% on top of that. We have no mechanism to deal with that. We're accepting increased tax revenue, but accepting all of the risk of dealing with the mitigation as well.
It may be the difference between the project happening and never happening, because that 10% is a fairly small number of spaces in reality, but digging to the 4th or 5th level may be economically so impractical that it just won't happen.
I get it. I'm just still wondering why it's our responsibility. Yeah, okay. We'll just
Right,
agree
this
to
is also
disagree on it.
happening in a universe in which the parking minimums have been dramatically decreased relative to current, right? So all of those projects that you just alluded to, excellent examples, under a new scheme, they would already have been looking at considerably reduced parking.
And they may have asked to be entirely relieved, as they did for Strayer, entirely relieved because they couldn't provide any. Or in the case of the Saul project, where the Trader Joe's, all of the parking for the north building is actually under the Trader Joe's and the residential and office building on the south block.
Question, though, is just in light of everything being proposed in terms of amendments, does the board have flexibility to grant 0 parking?
It has been done, yes.
Right. So, I mean, that's a bit of an answer, because the Strayer building right out here with the SunTrust Bank and the CVS does have 0 parking under it. I mean, I remember, that's been a while ago. So we're sort of talking about this slide, but goes well beyond that. We have complete flexibility regardless. This is just some sort of additional guideline.
It provides some guidance for when these kinds of situations come up. We have a townhouse project in Lyon Park on 7th Street. They were supposed to underground utilities and simply couldn't because a line to the Pentagon ran under their site. Now, that's not, analogous entirely to this, but there are things that are discovered in doing engineering and in doing analysis for projects that aren't always known beforehand that are legitimate constraints, not something that the developer chose to avoid.
So in the case of the Strayer development, they didn't have to contribute anything to TDM? We just said,
I don't remember that.
you're good?
Beyond a standard site plan condition.
That was a long time ago, so there might have been changes in the interim.
Remember
That
it,
was
That was a missed opportunity.
I'd add here,
a young woman back then. You're in your 20s, I think, Susan.
parking is modifiable by the board in, I think, every category, zoning category, except for RC. And so that is not modifiable by the board.
Okay. I'm going to go to Katie, and then I'm going to try to tie this up with looking at next steps.
I have an easy one. Does this apply only to brand-new site plans? Could someone who has an entitlement but has not yet built their project come in with a request for, I guess it'd be minor site plan amendment, to have the new minimums apply?
I cannot answer whether or not it's minor or major, but yes, it
could
would
they-
require a site plan amendment.
But they could come in. Somebody with a current entitlement, a project that went through SPRC under the current scheme of parking minimums, could come in and say, I'd like to be reconsidered under the new.
Yeah, with any policy like that, if the policy changes, I'm looking over at Mr. County Attorney to see if he's giving me you're screwing this up or not. But yes, they are able to. No, I'm just saying that, yes, like if the policy changes, you can come in for a site plan amendment of any kind.
Okay, thank you.
Simia, is there anything you want to add to that?
So it can be a sign.
Yeah, so that's it. It's consistent.
Typically, the ones we've seen have been minor. I think it would depend on the condition as it was written and what other changes they might be bringing forward. But I think minor amendment is usually, I don't think the zoning ordinance has anything specific related to necessarily.
Okay. Folks, what I'd like to do is we're going to talk about next steps. and then try to, try to see if there's any additional guidance of things we'd like people, the staff and consultant, to further flesh out. But the timeline is that you want to bring this to the board for a request to advertise in September. Is that correct? With have it on the agenda and then a full public hearing in October. Is that correct? Is that what I understand?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'm going to comment, and I think these were some comments. I know I had a few of these, but others, throw out what you think we need some more discussion of. I'll see if I can summarize my own. Does anyone here agree with me that the excess threshold, the dotted line, is too high? That's the 1.7. I honestly don't think, if we haven't had a site plan in 10 years that has come in at that level, I have no idea why we wouldn't lower that maximum. And remember, you can come in above that. It just means you pay a penalty because you are contradicting the policy goals and the objectives of the community. So I don't know where it goes, but I just think that that's a useless dotted line unless we bring it down. So does anyone else agree with me or no?
I do appreciate the thinking there. I think we have some work to do as a community to get around the idea of fewer parking spaces being in all of our interests and benefits. I think this conversation's been productive. We'll continue to have them. I don't think we're there yet, and I know that's where a lot of kind of leading edge communities are on parking maximums.
No. I'm not talking about where the most progressive ones are sometimes are not having minimums at all.
It's parking maximums.
And doing maximums. I'm not talking about that,
You're
changing
just
that.
talking about
I'm
bringing
just
that down.
saying changing the dotted line.
I know, but I think my point is to we as a community become, really more anchored in our understanding of what minimums we agree on. I think it's just a lot to expect those in the development community to kind of nail it, right? To hit it right, to be within a particular threshold. I would rather see us revisit that question, to keep it high for now, and revisit that question some number of years to come.
And I would say, I think the number is probably a bit too high, but I don't know what the number is. And, the question then becomes, at what point do you punish excess? And while I think sufficiency is probably a lot lower, I'm not sure I want to punish excess at a point below this, because this is a sea change. This is a paradigm shift.
Well, just to clarify, I don't think it is. We haven't had, tell me if I'm wrong, we have not had a site plan above that for 10 years, so there's nothing sea change about it. All it would be doing is capturing what we do now. If
Minimums thinking is a sea change.
No,
Everything else we've talked about tonight is a
anything
sea
coming in above 1.7 is a sea change of difference, which would be for the bad, for the worse. Is that not right? We have not had a site plan in 10 years that went above 1.7.
In at least 10. I don't know when the last one was. That was the furthest back we attempted to find.
But we've had demand at a point above 1.65. So if someone were to come up with a project for whatever reason that was analogous to a place with observed demand, and they were to right-size parking to meet that expected demand, we're going to punish it?
You're talking about on slide 13, the one bar over to the right?
Yeah, whatever that is.
Well, is that, really, can we look, do you mind having staff look into why that bar is it one project that was?
Yeah, I don't know.
That was built, how long ago? I don't know.
Where's the whisker on history?
Yeah.
So the attempt here with setting this excess, and I said earlier that it was, a compromise place, is to account for condo buildings being built without calling out condos specifically. So it's allowing that flexibility to go above and produce maybe 2 spaces per unit for some of your units, thinking that may occur, and allowing those to be viable projects. Since we can't just call out that initially, and we don't know that in the site plan, whether that's going to be a condo project or a rental project.
Right.
This is our attempt to do that.
Okay. I mean, there's no interest in pursuing that, I gather. I'm a little shocked, but that's all right. That's the way it goes.
I'm going to say I don't, I'm happy to get back to you on what that building was.
Tell me
but I
which
don't have it
building
right
that was. Okay, whatever. Whatever. No interest in that. The second thing was something Mr. Dorsey raised, which was the length of commitment. And I know we had a long conversation about this bike share and the car share length of commitment. I don't fully understand. I don't see the equity and value, and I don't understand why there wouldn't be a much longer commitment. I mean, you could have that car share, reduce 5 spaces, save $200,000 on 5 spaces, and then not have to pay anything because the car share is paying for itself through a private company and the users. So I just don't see an equity there at all. So does anyone else have interest in pursuing that further?
Yes.
Okay. The third one for me is, every time I look at that slide that has the bike share and car share in it, the 14, it bothers me that it suggests we're not going to get these things until we get down to these minimums and then go deeper. And these are all things that should be part of every site plan. So it bothers me that we're sending a message that, of course, it's bike spaces above the site plan requirement, but if it turns out we begin needing more, we should be changing the site plan condition. A car share, we should be requiring. To the degree that's part, at least if we're getting, it's back to that issue. If people are being given some incentive or opportunity to get lower, even if they're not down to these aspirational lows, why should we not have car share? It doesn't make sense to me. And maybe I think back on the trying to pull some value from the cost savings to the developer, but why would we want to wait until we're down below our very, very low aspiration to get car share? I don't get that.
Agreed.
I'm not understanding, so there are base site plan requirements for bike share. What does our base site plan
I don't-
requirement say about car share? Nothing?
No,
It's for bike parking.
For bike parking?
Not for bike share.
So our existing 4.1 process is silent on car share. Don't we do it in exchange for bonus density?
We've seen it enter a few site plans when it's negotiated, but it is not a standard site plan condition. And I don't know why, especially if we're suggesting through this process, people should come in and would come in with less parking.
But shouldn't we be asking the question, why is bike share and car share not part of our standard site plan conditions, rather than trying to figure out where it ranks in the parking minimums?
You could ask that. That would be a fair question.
But I would just say to another point, I can't even imagine a scenario, and we're processing a lot at this point, but I can't even imagine a scenario where you would gain favor to get to that aspirational minimum unless you're providing robust stuff like this anyway. So I can't even see a scenario where you'd then say, okay, and if you do more, if you're going to do more car share, we're going to give you less.
Yeah, that's,
But so,
Samia, what's in the site plan
I
condition?
just wanted to clarify that we've not negotiated car share and bike share for bonus density.
Okay.
So where we've had those discussions, it's been related to the parking modifications. And when there's been a request to reduce parking for site plan projects, then that's when we have those discussions.
Given me more fodder, because if that's the way we've approached reductions, and we're nowhere near yet these aspirational minimums, are we removing from the process the ability to negotiate that we've had for years through this proposal? Okay, you all need to just think on this some more, because we've come at this question from about 4 different directions, and it's got to settle down and percolate a little bit and let y'all think about it, talk to James and Susan and the manager and Carol and all, and then get back to us as we process this, because this is not a resolved issue yet as we approach the advertisement. But I don't know that we're going to make a lot more progress on it right now, but I think you're getting a sense. The last moments have helped crystallize it a little bit. So other things that people want to kind of revisit, or not revisit and discuss, but to surface that you think staff needs to further think about?
I would put in a plug for the constrained property piece and just how we think about that, if that's a separate and distinct bucket from what we were just discussing there. I'm just not yet,
Slide 17.
slide 17, yes, I'm just not
You had a
not
number
yet
of questions
comfortable
on
with that.
Got it.
I completely agree, and I think the specific question there is, if the idea of this whole reform or new policy is to create predictability, and these are sort of inherently unpredictable elements, is the right way to handle these unpredictable circumstances and site constraints through the kind of open-ended board flexibility and staff flexibility to discuss on an individual site-by-site basis? Does it make sense to codify that 10%?
Because in essence, this always remains our prerogative, right? Always.
Yeah. John?
Yeah, I would also, I talked a little bit about the so-called geography of attrition. I'd like a little more information and data on that, if you could, in terms of indicating that dynamic as to the residency of the person closest to Metro, and how that has, what the result of that Metro decline is in that data system. Also, we haven't really talked about demographics of age. So we have the Jefferson at Ballston. We have a couple of other seniors complexes not far from the heart of the RB corridor on the blue and yellow lines. And what I'm wondering is, do we have any data on on-site parking utilization at those predominantly senior complexes, and how that may weigh, and you don't have to answer this, Mr. Krim, now, but how that has informed your thoughts and discussion? And then finally, in terms of outreach, you indicated that the Economic Development Commission would not be taking this up until closer to the board taking action. Is that right? So if this is coming up to us in September, you would expect to have a briefing with AED in like late August, early September?
We've had a briefing with AED already, but not with Economic Development Commission.
Right, that's what I mean, the commission, okay. And then also, I think one of the things that I suggested in an earlier briefing was to reach out to the Commission on Aging. Did that occur, and what were the results, if so?
We did reach out to them. There was some back and forth with the chair. He had said, the first month proposed, we couldn't fit on the agenda, and I believe the last thing is I had emailed him, like, well, do you want some follow-up? And if I remember correctly, I didn't get a response, or the communication simply trailed off.
Okay, I want to make sure that gets done, so that we're factoring the varied needs of our seniors, many of whom don't have cars, but at the same time, we hear from many seniors that they feel too old for Metro or other modes of transportation, so they need a car, or they need a lift at least.
Okay, thanks, John. And finally, Katie, on some
Well,
outreach as well.
I'm remembering that one of our goals for this discussion was to agree on a schedule for commission and board action. So just wondering a little bit if you can say more about, are you intending, for example, to go back to some of the commissions you've already presented to, or is that the hearing is just sort of the standard, well, it's not a change to the zoning ordinance. So what is the working group and staff sense of what your proposed schedule for future commissions would be, or do you want input from us on what it ought to be?
Well, we'll always take input on what it ought to be, but I suppose what we had been thinking thus far is to go back for action to, at a minimum, transportation, planning, housing, and economic development for action. And I'm not probably going to use the correct term, but some sort of endorsement or support by a vote of the commission prior to our meeting at which we'd ask for board action.
Okay. And you all had mentioned that in response to board feedback and briefings, you'd gone to a few more civic associations. Was that right? So do you feel that you have more civic associations and community groups that you'd like to get in front of with the draft change?
Tell us which ones you've been to.
So in sum total, we have been to Aurora Highlands, Arlington Ridge, Ballston, Virginia Square, Clarendon Courthouse, Lyon Park. Oh, yes, we have had representatives from Ashton Heights at a focus group that we held in December. Though the civic associations that I've mentioned are the ones that we have presented to at one of their regular meetings. At this point, I mean, I think that we have provided multiple opportunities and requests for, invitations to present. We will be blasting out the recording of this when it goes live through the listserv that we maintain. But at this point, I have an invitation to attend the Radnor-Fort Myer. No, I'm sorry, not that one. There's one, yes. I'm not going to remember properly, but anyway, at an upcoming meeting, that one. There's one more.
North Highlands, maybe? There's North Highlands, North Roslyn, and Radnor-Fort Myer
I think it's North
Heights.
Highlands.
Okay.
Thank you. Beyond that, we don't have plans for further community meetings outside of the commissions and the board meeting.
The only thing that I could see that could be further of assistance is reaching out to potentially APA, HC Wesley, or anyone else who might be interested in developing in this corridor and seeing if we could get a focus group of their residents together.
Oh, okay.
I was thinking about that early on in our conversation. There are a lot of hypotheses that various residents in our community are happy to bring up about the sort of driving habits of folks who live in committed affordable housing, and I think it would behoove all of us to maybe hear some perspectives of those residents themselves.
Okay, fair enough. When you speak of this list or listserv, you said you will be blasting something out to whom?
So whenever there's been something like the working group report was posted, and then we had the survey put up. What I've done is we have a listserv maintained by communication staff that reaches, at last count, like 410 individuals, and then I've sent emails to the civic associations in the two corridors, to the presidents of those civic associations, to let them know that there's something on the website.
Okay, I would suggest that as far as the laying out of the process from here, sort of the work session's completed, you'll be compiling the survey, et cetera, the various steps, advertisement in September, hearing in October. You certainly want to get that information out. And you probably want to say something along the lines of any civic association that has not met or wants an update, you're available to do that only to a certain point, because at some point in the process it will be too late, so sometime maybe through September. You may hear from the other half a dozen or so civic associations that have not yet communicated, and who knows, some of them could have been so long ago they feel it's changed. I don't know. The only other suggestion I had were the bids. The bids, and it was referenced even earlier that, for certain things, they may be part of the solution. In fact, the bids and partnerships, well, at least the one partnership, that Clarendon, but the 3 bids should be on your list, I would suggest, and you might offer to present to them if they're interested.
Mr. Facette?
Yeah. Hi, Libby.
Yeah, and I would just add, it's really adding a little bit, I think Katie and John were both getting to it, if it's possible to get more sort of granular demographic data, not only on seniors, millennials, families. I mean, I think we all have assumptions about who, uses transit and who uses cars. But if we could get some good data, I think that might be useful. So if a building is being built and it's going to be all older people, we'll know what that proportion is, which would probably be very different from a building that's going in and they're expecting mostly millennials. And then also, I think, which Katie touched on and I did earlier, if there's a way to break down the population of low-income folks somehow, because I think they're different groups, and if it's possible to sort of sift them out, I think some of them tend to have cars and some of them do not, and if there's a way to kind of identify that, it would be great. And then finally, also on low-income, I'm sure, for example, people with disabilities don't tend to have cars. So if there's any way to kind of break out demographic data that way, I think that would be helpful.
Sorry, so just to be clear, I was suggesting not a separate disaggregation of the data, but rather a focus group. And I know you all spoke with the Disability Commission and got some excellent feedback that was reflected here. So that was sort of the intent of my suggestion of a focus group of residents.
Yeah, Yeah, that's fine. I mean, if you can't, getting data I know can be very complicated and difficult, but if it would be possible to have it, or if there's some research done elsewhere, I think it might be useful.
Okay, is there anything else? James, you will have the next to last word.
I just want to thank the working group members. 2 of them have joined us. So Dennis and Ben, who participated in the working group, thanks to them and to the others who couldn't be with us.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody. And thank you all very much. I think this was very useful, and we'll look forward to the manager's recommendation in September, and we'll begin to work on that some more. All right. Thanks very much. We are adjourned.